June 1903. Henry Ford was 40 years old, broke, and viewed by the Detroit elite as a two-time loser who preferred tinkering with race cars to building a viable business. Working out of a converted wagon shop on Mack Avenue with a measly $28,000 in borrowed capital, he was one bad month away from permanent obscurity. Within a decade, he would not only dominate the automotive world, but fundamentally rewire the human experience, turning the luxury of the elite into the birthright of the masses. But the blue oval logo hides a history written in blood, paranoia, and a radicalisation of a generation. From the iron-fisted surveillance of his own workers to the publication of hate speech that inspired dictators, Ford's legacy is a jagged landscape of industrial genius and moral rot. This is the story of the man who put the world on wheels and then tried to control exactly where they turned. The American dream in the early 1900s was a stagnant, muddy affair. The horse was still king, and the few automobiles that chugged through the streets of New York and Chicago were temperamental toys for the ultra-wealthy. They cost more than a family home and required a personal mechanic to keep them running for more than a mile. Henry Ford looked at this landscape and saw something different. He didn't want to build a toy, he wanted to build a tool. After two failed ventures, the Detroit Automobile Company and the Henry Ford Company, he finally hit his stride with the Ford Motor Company. His vision was the Model T, introduced in 1908. It was simple, rugged, and most importantly, cheap. But the real revolution wasn't the car itself, it was how it was born. In 1913, at the Highland Park plant, Ford and his engineers perfected the moving assembly line. Before this, a car chassis took over 12 hours to assemble. After the line started moving, that time plummeted to 93 minutes. Ford had turned the act of creation into a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat. By 1927, 15 million Model Ts had rolled off the line, and the horse was effectively extinct. Ford had democratised movement, but in doing so, he had turned his workers into extensions of the machinery. The assembly line was a meat grinder of human potential. Men stood in one spot for 9 hours a day, performing a single repetitive motion every few seconds. It was mind-numbing, soul-crushing work that led to massive turnover. To solve this, Ford announced the $5 day in 1914. It was double the going rate for industrial labour and sent shockwaves through the world. Thousands of people flocked to Detroit, sleeping in parks just for a chance at the Ford gates. But this wasn't charity, it was a pact with the devil. To earn that $5, a worker had to live according to Henry Ford's personal moral code. He established the Ford Sociological Department, a private police force that visited workers' homes to ensure they weren't drinking, gambling, or living in unhygienic conditions. They checked if children were in school and the lawn was mowed. If a worker was a recent immigrant, they were forced into the Ford English School, where a literal graduation ceremony involved walking into a giant wooden melting pot in traditional ethnic clothing and emerging on the other side in a business suit, waving an American flag. Ford didn't just want your labour, he wanted your soul. He wanted a workforce of identical, predictable, sober cogs. As the company grew into a global behemoth, Ford's personal obsessions began to curdle into something far more dangerous. He purchased a local newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and used it as a megaphone for his increasingly virulent anti-Semitism. For years, the paper published a series of articles titled The International Jew, which blamed Jewish people for everything from the decline of American music to the start of world wars. These weren't just the ramblings of a localised crank. Ford was one of the most respected men on earth. His words carried the weight of his empire. In Germany, a young politician named Adolf Hitler became an ardent admirer. Hitler kept a life-size portrait of Ford next to his desk and quoted Ford's writings in his own manifesto. In 1938, on his 75th birthday, Henry Ford became the first American to receive the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honour Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. While Ford's factories would eventually become the arsenal of democracy during World War II, the ideological seeds he planted had already set the world on fire. The man who claimed to hate war had provided the intellectual fuel for the century's greatest atrocity. Inside the factory walls, the atmosphere turned from paternalistic to paranoid. As the Great Depression took hold, Ford relied on Harry Bennett, a former sailor and boxer who ran the Ford service department. Bennett was Ford's personal enforcer, a man who kept lions in his office and hired ex-convicts and street thugs to keep the workers in line. The service department was effectively a private army used to crush any attempt at unionisation. The tension boiled over on May 26, 1937, in what became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Union organisers, including future UAW leader Walter Reuther, were peacefully distributing leaflets outside the River Rouge plant. Bennett's goons didn't just ask him to leave, they beat them nearly to death.
The photographs of the bloody, battered organisers were published nationwide, shattering the myth of Ford as the benevolent father of his workers. The empire was revealed to be a police state, held together by the thread of a lead pipe to the skull. Even Ford's attempts at expansion were marked by a bizarre colonial hubris. In the late 1920s, he decided he didn't want to pay the British or Dutch for rubber. He wanted his own supply. He bought nearly 2.5 million acres in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon to create Fordlandia. It was intended to be a perfect Midwestern town transplanted into the jungle, complete with white picket fences, square dancing, and a diet of brown bread and canned peaches. Ford ignored the advice of botanists and local experts. He cleared the jungle and planted rubber trees in tight rows, creating a buffet for indigenous leaf blight. The trees died. The workers, forced to follow Michigan time and eat Michigan food in the tropical heat, eventually revolted in a machete-wielding riot. Millions of dollars were poured into the mud before the project was abandoned as a rotting skeleton in the rainforest. It was a monument to the idea that the Ford way was the only way, and the jungle had disagreed. By the time Henry Ford II took over from his grandfather in 1945, the company was losing $9 million a month. The elder Ford had become a senile, suspicious shell, and the company was a chaotic mess of overlapping departments and missing records. The younger Ford brought in the Whiz Kids, a group of former Air Force officers led by Robert McNamara, who used cold, hard data to drag the company into the modern age. This era brought the iconic Mustang and the dominance of the F-Series truck, but it also ushered in a new kind of corporate coldness. In the 1970s, the Ford Motor Company faced one of the most scandalous episodes in business history, the Ford Pinto. The car had a fatal design flaw. Because of the placement of the fuel tank, a rear-end collision at even low speeds could cause the car to erupt in a fireball. Internal memos later revealed a chilling calculation. Ford executives had performed a cost-benefit analysis. They calculated that it would cost $11 per car to fix the flaw. Multiplying that by millions of cars, they compared it to the projected cost of settling lawsuits for the estimated 180 burn deaths and 180 serious injuries the flaw would cause. The math told them it was cheaper to let people burn. It was a PR disaster that cost the company its reputation and hundreds of millions in damages, proving that the ruthlessness of the assembly line had mutated into a spreadsheet that treated human life as a rounding error. Today, the Ford Motor Company is a survivor. It was the only one of the big three American automakers to avoid a government bailout during the 2008 financial crisis. It has pivoted to electric vehicles and dominates the American landscape with the F-150, a vehicle that has been the best-selling truck for nearly half a century. The blue oval is a symbol of American resilience, industrial might, and the spirit of the open road. But you cannot look at a Ford without seeing the ghosts of the past. Behind the sleek lines of the Lightning EV and the roar of the Mustang lies the shadow of a man who believed people were programmable machines. The legacy is one of contradictions. The man who created the modern middle class also funded the propaganda that nearly destroyed it. The company that built the bombers that saved Europe also accepted medals from the regime that tried to enslave it. Ford didn't just build cars, he built the world we live in. We are all living in the world Henry Ford designed, driving down roads he paved, trapped in a cycle of production and consumption he perfected.
This is the story of the empire that put us in the driver's seat, only to realise we were never the ones steering.